Hello, and welcome to Epidemiology, one of the most exciting and fastest growing of the medical sciences. Of course, I'm biased. I'm an epidemiologist, but maybe after you hear a little bit about it, you'll feel the same way as me. The thing about epidemiology that makes it so fascinating is, first of all, in my opinion, it's the only medical science that probably doesn't involve a lot of medicine. And also, some epidemiologists are sort of like medical detectives. They're on the ground collecting data, talking to people, solving mysteries about what causes diseases in a population. It can be quite sexy, quite exciting, kind of like a police investigator except around medicine. So today, we're going to learn about the differences between descriptive and analytical studies in epidemiology. We're going to learn a little bit about the historical origins of epidemiology, where it came from, and maybe even where it's going. And we're also going to learn a little bit about the triumphs of epidemiology, because I think it's important to brag a little bit about the things that we've done for society over the last couple of hundred years. So when we talk about epidemiology, it's traditional to define it first. It's difficult to define, however. This is one particularly popular definition is offered by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlantic Georgia, and they say that epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease or health status in a population. Okay. Wikipedia offers a little more complicated definition, calling it the branch of medicine that deals with incidence, distribution, and so forth. I would add in prevalence and mortality and so forth. It gets complicated pretty fast and pretty dry. Most textbook definitions of epidemiology land somewhere between the two poles of the CDC and Wikipedia. I will offer you another definition. In my opinion, it's the science of science. Or if you want to be a little drier, it's the science of looking at the health of populations rather than of individuals. Hopefully this will all be clearer to you when we're done the lecture. Our story begins in the early 19th century in London, England, when a man named John Snow, whose name you might have heard of, decided to investigate a cholera outbreak that was happening in London at the time. Now, back then, we didn't know a lot about what caused diseases. There was a few theories. Some were more fantastical than others, but there wasn't a lot of evidence to support many of the theories. John Snow's innovation was that he was going to use maps and numbers to describe the epidemic, the outbreak. Now, to us today, that seems kind of rational, kind of boring, kind of everyday. Back then, it was revolutionary. So what he did was he figured out that back in London in the 19th century, several neighborhoods were being served by water pumping stations. And he reasoned that probably cholera was waterborne. And he took the time to figure out which pumping stations were providing what water to what neighborhoods. His investigation led him to conclude that one particular pump, the Broad Street pump, was likely responsible for most of the cholera outbreaks in that city. You can go to London today and actually visit the Broad Street pump. There's a plaque there that says, this is the spot where epidemiology was born, or something like that. It's quite fascinating. I encourage you to go if you can. Let's look a little bit at the history of disease before we continue. Before John Snow and his brethren made their innovations and discoveries, it was thought that diseases were caused by miasma. What's miasma? It's some kind of fantastical, poisonous, magical vapor or mist that would emanate from swamps of the ground, and people would shut their windows at night so it didn't get into their houses and cause them to be sick, and it had a foul smell associated with it. Miasma doesn't really exist. We know that today because we know that diseases are caused by infectious agents. Microbes, pathogens, bacteria, viruses. And we know this because around the same time that John Snow was making his investigations, the microscope made its first appearance, and we could see these microbes in action. So it was a revolutionary time. Let's look a little bit at the data that John Snow collected. He looked at the number of houses being served by a variety of pumping companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall Company, the Lambeth Company, and other companies in London. He saw that each was servicing a different number of houses, and he counted the number of deaths from cholera experienced by those neighborhoods. To most people, the number of deaths alone were sufficient to tell the story. But that's not where John Snow stopped. He divided the number of deaths by the number of houses being served in each neighborhood and got a quotient, a ratio, a proportion. Again, to us today, that's an obvious thing to do. Back then, it was revolutionary. It was an innovation. And by looking at the quotient, the proportion. He discovered that a majority of deaths were being caused by one particular pumping station, and he narrowed it down to one pump, the Broad Street pump. And today, that's why we have the science of epidemiology. It's the science of using non-medical tools, mathematics, paper, your mind, your hands, your feet, to learn something about disease that otherwise you would not have known. So today we have different kinds of epidemiologists. I mentioned that John Snow was a kind of outbreak investigator, a medical detective of some kind. Most physicians who are epidemiologists are clinical epidemiologists, and they bring to bear a variety of perspectives. They bring to bear the choices made by their patients, the clinical research and practice experience that they have, and also the experiences of their mentors to make decisions for small groups of people, usually in a clinical environment. Public health epidemiologists are people like John Snow. These are the individuals who investigate outbreaks, who figure out which sandwich at the picnic gave you diarrhea, who figure out what's probably causing that outbreak of disease in that community over there. They're also the ones who plan the vaccine schedules for a community. And population epidemiologists look at large disease trends in a population, the incidence and prevalence, the risk factors that cause diseases, and so forth. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap in all these different types of epidemiologists, and there are newer, emerging types of epidemiologists today. Epidemiology is forging partnerships with political science, with economics, with computer science and genetics. It's a fast evolving and diversifying science. So before I continue, I want to talk about how we know what we know. It's important to understand where our discipline fits into the science of knowing. And we call this paradigms of research, paradigms of knowing. When we talk about paradigms, we're talking about how our discipline interacts with the world and understands knowledge and evidence and truth. There are several dimensions to a paradigm, and I'll suggest to you that there are three main pillars philosophically of how to define a paradigm. The first is ontology, and that's how we experience reality. Is reality defined by my imagination, or your imagination? Or is your reality defined by some objective truth of the universe? Then we deal with epistemology, and that's how we acquire and process knowledge. Do we know about the universe from interrogating it, from talking to people, from collecting data? And then we have our methodology. Maybe the ways in which we design our studies, that determines how we understand the universe. The important part about all this is that paradigms of research allow us to define how the world works and how we extract knowledge from it. A psychologist, a political scientist, an economist, an anthropologist, and an epidemiologist interact with the world a bit differently and define knowledge a bit differently. We define the questions that we ask a bit differently as well. When we look at evidence-based medicine, we're going to phrase a research question, and the paradigm of knowledge from which we arise helps us define the types of questions that we can ask. Our paradigm of research also tells us what is publishable and what isn't, because it defines what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes proper evidence. And epidemiology is, I hope you will conclude with me, all about how we rank evidence and understand truth. In essence, a paradigm tells us how the world is structured and tells us what determines meaning and significance. Epidemiology exists within something we call the etiologic paradigm, which is a kind of positivism. And it purports that there exists external objective truth that we can access via our methodologies, our science, our study designs. And we can measure risk factors and things that cause outcomes. Smoking causes cancer. This behavior will cause this other kind of outcome. That's the nature of the epidemiologic etiologic paradigm. I bring this up because it's important that we remember that epidemiology, and any discipline for that matter, is but one path to knowledge. There are a variety of paths to knowledge. Different disciplines have their own paths. It's important that we don't descend into arrogance when we consider the evidence that we choose to base our medical decision-making on. So let's now change gears a bit and talk about terminology. It's important that we get our words straight before we can talk more deeply about epidemiology and how to use it. When we're in mathematics versus clinical research versus laboratory research versus epidemiology, some common concepts often have different names. So we have clinical research and mathematical relationships, and in this domain, we have independent and dependent variables. So an independent variable is free to be whatever it wants, but it determines the value of dependent variables. In epidemiologic research, a variable that predicts an outcome is an exposure. You're exposed to something which may lead to an outcome. You can be exposed to a contaminant, a pollutant, maybe something in your food, and the outcome could be a disease, a cancer, or some other kind of behavior. So again, traditionally, we have independent variables that lead to dependent variables. In epidemiology, these are exposures leading to outcomes. The example that I'm fond of making all the time is that smoking is an independent variable. You are free, you're independent to smoke if you want to, or not smoke if you want to. But the smoking causes a certain outcome, and that outcome could be lung cancer. Now, an exposure that increases or decreases the likelihood for developing a certain outcome or disorder, commonly diseases, we call that a risk factor. Now go back to John Snow again. John Snow discovered that water from this pumping station was likely associated with cholera. He didn't know how it worked. He didn't understand the biology, the mechanism by which water caused the disease. He just knew that this water was a risk factor for getting the disease. And this really is one of the foundations for public health epidemiology. We can measure statistically the relationship between risk factors and outcomes, and thus we can control the risk factors and maybe then control the outcomes without knowing the relationship, without knowing the mechanism of how that risk factor caused the outcome, or in fact, if it was indeed causal. For example, smoking causes lung cancer. We know this because there's a strong statistical association between whether or not you smoke and whether or not you are likely to get lung cancer. You don't have to know the science or the biology or the mechanism of how the smoking causes the lung cancer. It helps, it's useful. We recommend that we figure this out, but we don't have to know in order to have a public health intervention epidemiologically. I can control the risk factor and thus reduce the likelihood of the outcome. Sometimes when people say the epidemiology of a disease, what they actually mean is the description of that disease. And that brings us to talking about descriptive epidemiology or descriptive study. By the way, I don't like it when we say the epidemiology of a disease. It's a limiting description of the full breadth and majesty and complexity of what the science of epidemiology brings to the table. But when they say descriptive epidemiology, what we're really talking about is the who gets a disease or an outcome, the what is that they're getting, the where is it happening, and when is it happening. Notice that there is no why there, just four W's, who, what, where, and when. When we're into the why, we're into a deeper kind of investigation. Descriptive epidemiology only cares about describing the who, what, where, and the when. So let's think of an example. Let's decide that we're going to investigate the prevalence of left-handedness among students in your neighborhood. Who are we dealing with? Students. What? Left-handedness. Where? The place where you live, your neighborhood. And when? Right now. We care about measuring this prevalence, this distribution right now. And so the thing that I'm measuring, the thing that I'm ascertaining is right now, 23% of students in your neighborhood are left-handed. That's a very simple and relatively useless observation, but a good description of descriptive epidemiology. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the way that study designs are taxonomized, how we categorize them, because a large part of epidemiology is in designing studies to acquire the evidence that fits within our research paradigm. So the first large delineation I want to draw attention to is qualitative versus quantitative studies. In qualitative research, that's the world of social sciences, the world of political science, and sometimes health sciences. That's when we're dealing with descriptions that are qualitative, words, themes, things like that. Quantitative research is numbers, statistics, and that's where we're going to live. We're going to live in the world of quantitative research in epidemiology. Amongst quantitative studies, we have descriptive versus analytical studies. Now, descriptive studies we've talked about already. That's the who, what, where, and when. right? And one example of a descriptive study is a cross-sectional study, which we will describe in greater depth later. But I just did an example. Left-handedness in my neighborhood. That's a cross-sectional description of a particular phenomenon. When we are looking at two different variables or more variables and how they relate to one another, then we're into the world of analysis, into analytical studies. Now, descriptive studies dealt with one variable, really, describing left-handedness. Analytical studies are looking at two variables or more and a relationship between them. Amongst analytical studies, there are two other categories, observational or experimental. Amongst observational studies, there are three, perhaps four large categories: the case control, the cohort, different kinds of cross-sectional studies, and possibly this thing called an ecological study, all of which we'll learn more about in another lecture. The distinguishing characteristic of observational studies is that we observe them. The universe unfolds and we observe. We don't determine who does what or who gets what. All we do is we watch and we marvel in the way that the universe unfolds. Experiments, on the other hand, that's when we do get to interfere a bit. The classical experiment in epidemiology is the randomized controlled trial, or the RCT, also called clinical trials. There are other kinds of experiments as well. There are quasi-experimental designs, there are natural experiments, and we'll talk about more of those in a future lecture as well. Now, when the layperson thinks about an experiment, they mean any kind of study, any kind of investigation. When epidemiologists talk about an experiment, we mean something very particular. We're talking about when we manipulate a variable. So perhaps we are deciding who gets a drug versus who gets a placebo, or who gets to smoke versus who doesn't smoke. Whenever we are telling people what to do, we are conducting an experiment. We manipulate something. We manipulate a variable. In observational studies, we don't. We let the universe unfold as it would. We let people choose what they're going to do. We may select them based upon what they're doing, but we don't tell them what to do. An experiment involves us changing a variable. Well, now that we've covered the differences between analytical and descriptive studies and differences between observational and experimental studies, let's look at some historical examples. In particular, I want to talk about the triumphs of epidemiology, one in particular, and it's this. You may recognize this photo. You may recognize this disease. This is smallpox, one of the great scourges of humankind, one of the great burdens of human civilization. And smallpox is particular because it is the first human disease deliberately eradicated by human beings. And we did this in 1980, in large part due to some innovative approaches by epidemiologists. Heroes, I would argue. So, as I mentioned, smallpox was defined to be eradicated by the WHO in 1980, but attempts to do so go back decades before then. In 1975, this individual, Rahima Banu, I think she's from Bangladesh, was the last person to contract natural smallpox. And since then, we don't know of any individual who has contracted natural smallpox. So we're pretty confident the smallpox has been eradicated. I'm sufficiently old that I still have a mark on my shoulder from my smallpox vaccine. It left a large mark. But young people today don't have that mark. They don't have that burden because we have eliminated the need for that vaccine. I love this particular quote by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Edward Jenner in 1806. He says, and the critical part of this letter is the last sentence, "Future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox has existed." It's important because Edward Jenner devised the first workable smallpox vaccine in the early 1800s. And Thomas Jefferson implies in his letter that due to that vaccine, we will no longer have a smallpox problem. But it took another 180 years for us to truly eradicate smallpox. So clearly the solution for beating back this disease wasn't simply the technology of vaccination. It was something a little more complicated, more profound, more interesting. And that's where the science of epidemiology came in. It was a need to compute the numbers of people who need to be vaccinated to truly eradicate the disease. And this was made possible because of something called herd immunity. Herd immunity is when individuals in a population are immune to a disease and thus prevent other individuals who are not immune from getting contact with that disease. If you think about a herd of cattle, those at the center of the herd will never have any contact with anyone outside of the herd because they're protected by those on the periphery. So long as those on the periphery are immune or have been vaccinated, then the ones in the center don't need to be. In other words, not everybody in the herd needs to be vaccinated, just a certain proportion. Epidemiologists stepped in and computed that proportion that was needed to ensure that smallpox would be eradicated. Let's look at the timeline of smallpox in human civilization. Going back centuries, if not millennia, smallpox was a major scourge of humankind. In the 18th century, attempts at finding a treatment made some great progress, with Edward Jenner creating the first variolation attempts. But back then, 400,000 people would die every year, at least. It was quite the killer. A third of the survivors, though, became blind, and so they lived on with disability. So it's not just about the disease killing people. It's not just about the mortality. It's also about the morbidity. And it's important that we keep in mind that when we're looking at the impact of disease, it's not just the deaths we care about. It's the effects on the quality of life that matter. The people who survive also developed immunity to smallpox. This is an important consideration when we talk about eradicating the disease. Once you've got it, you're not going to get it again. We can cross you off the list of someone who needs to be inoculated. So Edward Jenner took interest in cowpox, which was a kind of smallpox that cattle had, and he noticed that people who were milking cows would be exposed to cowpox and tended to be immune to smallpox as a result. So he got the idea that exposure to this particular infection of cowpox may imbue an individual with a kind of immunity to smallpox. So in the 1950s, the world took notice that maybe it was time to have a more militaristic administrative attempt to control smallpox globally. In 1967, a decision was made by the WHO to attempt to eradicate and remove this scourge from the human experience altogether. And as I mentioned, in 1980, this was accomplished. WHO had eradicated smallpox entirely. A great triumph. So to review that timeline, in 1967, we began the eradication process, and back then 15 million people were developing smallpox every year, but 2 million died every year. And today, no one dies anymore from smallpox. So, one of the important qualities of epidemiology is through the observational process, we can determine risk factors and likely causes of disease. I say likely causes because I use that word cause very carefully. We'll talk later on about how we define what a causal factor is. But in absence of knowing for sure that something causes something else, we call it a risk factor, and we talk about associations rather than causations. So many times we don't know the cause of a disease, but we can associate it with various exposures. For example, streptococcal infection is often followed by rheumatic fever and sometimes rheumatic heart disease. So we can prevent rheumatic heart disease by preventing streptococcal infection, even if we're not entirely sure what the causal mechanism might be. We know that rheumatic fever is more frequent amongst Army recruits than in school children. So now we know the population to focus on and when an intervention is most likely. Lung cancer and smoking is the classic example. It was fought in courts for many years about whether or not tobacco really was a cause of lung cancer, and we're pretty sure that it is. But in absence of solid laboratory evidence, we had mountains of epidemiological observational evidence showing that people who smoked tended to have lung cancer more so than people who didn't smoke. The power of observation, in many cases, overcomes the need for solid, specific causal information. Observational epidemiology is also useful for understanding morbidity and mortality from diseases in the population as a whole. We can associate lifestyle factors like driving without a seatbelt, or eating too much fat, or having too many calories in our diet, or being too immobile and not moving enough, with other kinds of negative health outcomes. We don't need to know the mechanism in order to be able to control the outcome by controlling lifestyle choices and risk factors. Let's talk about some of the important tasks that epidemiologists are engaged in. Well, the first and most important thing that a population epidemiologist cares about is disease surveillance. Most modern countries have several complicated surveillance programs in action all the time, including something called a notifiable disease registry. That's when a list of key diseases are made so that anytime a health professional encounters one, they must by law inform the government or whoever's in charge of that surveillance program that they saw a case. In this way, we have a solid idea of whether or not our country or population has a particular disease. Some of the key ones include tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS, or even Ebola now has made the list in recent months in most countries. Disease surveillance allows us to detect whether or not an epidemic is happening. It allows us to detect whether or not a disease is changing its profile in a way. And it allows us to predict or detect anytime the population is changing its behavior with respect to certain diseases as well. Epidemiologists are also involved in diagnostic tests. We're going to go into greater detail on diagnostic tests in a further lecture, but know right now that these tests involve computing things like sensitivity and specificity, deciding whether or not we can use this test in this context, or whether or not a test is viable as a screening tool to identify individuals who are good candidates for further investigation further on. Epidemiologists are also useful in trend analysis, and we're going to talk a little bit more about trend analysis in a second. This is when we look at the changes in diseases over time or over populations and try to ascertain some wisdom from looking at the changes in the numbers without actually investigating individual cases. And also, one of the important things that clinical epidemiologists and population epidemiologists do is designing studies. So very often, a researcher will contract an epidemiologist to go over their study design and their protocols to make sure that everything is methodologically sound. Now let's look at some of the issues in trend analysis. Here's an example from U.S. data. This is the changes in mortality rates of white women and lung cancer. As you can see, from 1973 to 1995, the mortality rates were going up dramatically. This is white women in America dying of lung cancer. If you look at black women, well, the rates are kind of the same. So there's no reason to expect white women and black women to be physiologically different, so this is not surprising. If you look at breast cancer, white women, the rates have come down slightly from 1973 to 1995. With black women, they've gone up. That's interesting. Here's all the data in one slide. We see that there are no changes or no differences between white and black women except with respect to breast cancer. That's very interesting, and there could be a host of reasons for this observation, including something we call detection bias. That's when we're looking for more cases, so we find more cases. And again, we'll talk more about detection bias in a future lecture about biases. But the point I'm trying to make here is that trend analysis allows us to know what questions to ask, allows us to ascertain that there's probably something happening here that I need to investigate further. So, what have we learned as a result of this lecture? Well, you've learned the origins of epidemiology. You know that it began in England in the early 19th century with a bit of medical detective work by John Snow. And since then, it's evolved into a host of other realms, including clinical epidemiology and genetic epidemiology and population epidemiology and data science and all these other categories of epidemiology that maybe you're interested in now. Now you can distinguish between descriptive and analytical studies. Descriptive epidemiology, remember, is when we're describing a scenario. We care about the who, the what, the where, and the when. Analytical studies is when we are drawing relationships between two variables. And now you can identify the different types of epidemiologists, the clinical epidemiologists, the population epidemiologists, and the public health epidemiologists.